So I think we're ready to get started here, guys. Welcome back to Seal Island National Wildlife Refuge. Again, my name is Keenan Yakola. I'm one of the co-supervisors, and this is Isabel Brofsky. I think we should start by just telling you about where we are right now. We're here at one of the freshwater ponds on the island, and behind us you're going to be seeing some terns flying around. It would be great if you guys keep an eye on them. We might see some chicks that have recently fledged out of the nest, and they could be flying around back there, so keep an eye on them. I think that it would also be best if we could give you an update about our season so far. You guys just kind of watch the cams, but you don't really know what's happening besides just really the small sample size that you're watching. So I'm going to have Isabel fill you in a little bit about the terns and what's been happening with the terns. The terns are a great indicator for us to tell us what's happening and around the entire ecosystem of the Gulf of Maine. So why don't you tell them what we've been seeing for fish, how we're doing for productivity, maybe what's been a problem for the terns this year. Why don't you fill them in on that?
All right, so as Keenan said, the terns are a really good indicator for environmental health in the Gulf of Maine here. So we do a lot of monitoring of productivity and what the terns are feeding their chicks throughout the season. And right about now we have lots of tern chicks just starting to fledge. We are doing lots of feeding studies where we sit in blinds and we record what types of fish, what sizes of fish, and how often they're bringing food into their chicks. So we're monitoring those nests, and then we go out about every other day to check on our productivity plots, which are fenced-in plots that we check regularly to weigh and measure the chicks that are growing in there, and we use that for our growth studies and for our productivity analysis. And so one thing we've definitely been noticing this year is that the terns are experiencing some definitely some challenges in terms of food supply and species of fish that they're bringing in, and challenges in terms of being able to fledge their chicks. And what we've noticed is, first of all, in terms of the species of fish that we're seeing get brought in, while we normally see a lot of fish called hake and herring, which are really excellent food for growing tern chicks. They have a lot of nutritional value. We've also seen a lot of another species of fish called butterfish, which is many of you may be aware of. It's a very deep-bodied fish that most of the tern chicks are actually unable to swallow. And so unfortunately, when we see these large runs of butterfish, we know that the chicks, well, we watch the chicks being unable to eat those, and so they're not getting as much nutrition as they should be. We've also been seeing a lot of sort of alternatives to fish coming into the chicks lately. Things that are very odd to see tern chicks being fed, like insects, including moths and some other insects like bees and flies. So that just is kind of an indication that there isn't that much food available, or at least not as much of the food that they would prefer to be feeding their chicks. Things that have lots of nutritional value, like herring or hake, another species of fish. So it does seem like there's a lack of food, and there's a lack of good food on top of that. So unfortunately, it's been kind of a tough year for the terns. We've been seeing a lot of the younger chicks in the nests having a difficult time getting enough food to survive. A lot of the chicks that are fledging now are having a hard time doing so because they don't have a lot of fat reserves built up. And another thing that this is kind of an indication for is that, well, one thing we've seen is that there's actually been a lot warmer weather this year, a lot warmer sea surface temperatures as well, and the fish that we're seeing are also an indication that the sea temperatures are warmer. The butterfish that I mentioned earlier are a warmer water fish, and so seeing a lot of butterfish means that the climate's definitely warming up, and sea temperatures are warming up, and so those sort of changes definitely are a challenge for these tern species. So it's definitely interesting to see those interactions, and yeah, it's also been difficult to watch as well because they are facing lots of challenges.
And I think that it's important to say when Isabel says challenges, we mean that we're seeing a lot of chicks dying, which is definitely a sad thing to see. We've seen it with the guillemot chicks, and we've seen it with puffin chicks as well. It's these challenges that they're having with food and weather just often lead to the younger chicks in the nest, what we call the B chick or the beta chick, that ends up with them dying because they can't get enough resources to be able to fledge. These chicks take a lot of food and energy to be able to fledge, and if they don't get that, then it's very possible that they will die, which is what we're seeing. So before we jump into the questions, I just want to remind you guys that we need a lot of questions for you guys to continue this conversation. So please keep sending those questions in, and that will ensure that we have a full live chat. We can go for the full hour. If we don't get the questions, it's very difficult for us to push through this hour. So right now we only have 6 questions, so please send in more questions. We'll be happy to answer them all. So the first question, well, I want to apologize for the wind. It's very windy outside, so the camera might be shaking around a lot. It might be difficult to hear us. If anybody has any challenges hearing us or anything like that, please let the people at Explore know, and they can contact us, and we'll try to figure something out so you can hear us. So there's going to be a lot of questions about guillemots today, and I want to preface our conversation about guillemots by saying that we actually don't know too much about the black guillemots that are nesting on all of the Project Puffin Islands. Really the only thing that we do with our black guillemots is the productivity checks, and that's pretty much, we do the same thing with puffins. We go through and we check a subset of burrows about every 5 days, and we weigh and measure those chicks, and we monitor how many are hatching, how many might be dying. And that's pretty much all we do. We don't even have an exact number on the number of black guillemots that are nesting on Seal Island. But we do keep track of high counts, and we get those high counts by counting the amount of guillemots that are around the island that we can visually see with binoculars or a spotting scope. Now, to give you kind of an idea of what an average high count of puffins might be on a good day on the island, we might see around 400 to 450 puffins. We do know that there's about 500 pairs of puffins. So the highest count of black guillemots this season was over 1,200 guillemots. So that, to me, that indicates that there's probably well over 800 pairs of guillemots on the island, if I had to take a guess. Around that number, maybe a little less, maybe a little more. We're not completely sure. We can't keep track of all the guillemots on the island. As I've told you guys before, this island is over a mile long, and it's about 70 acres, and that's way too much for us to cover with the amount of people that we have. And they're nesting literally all over the island, unlike puffins that are only in special areas where there's enough habitat for them. So we're going to do our best to answer your questions, because a lot of them are directed to specifically the black guillemots that are nesting on Seal Island. So we'll do our best to answer that. So the first 2 questions that we have are regarding the black guillemots, and I'm going to let Isabel start to answer these questions. But a lot of people want to know about the interaction between the A chick and the B chicks, and also maybe why they lay a second egg. One of the viewers asks, is the extra egg, meaning the second egg in the burrow, that much insurance to a guillemot family, and why do they do this? So we'll try to answer that first. So we'll try to answer why these interactions, often these kind of bullying interactions, are happening, and maybe there's another question about why it's unusual, if it's unusual, for a B chick to die in the same burrow in consecutive years. Because last year we did unfortunately lose our B chick in the same burrow. So, Isabel, why don't you tell them a little bit about black guillemots, and maybe about why is this all happening? Why do guillemots do this? Why did the chicks die? Why is this happening? And maybe I think we can draw a lot of comparisons to the terns that are nesting here, because they do the same thing as these guillemot chicks.
All right, so yeah, so black guillemots, they're kind of unique in the alcid family in that they do raise, or they lay 2 eggs and attempt to raise 2 chicks, whereas most of their alcids only have 1 egg and 1 chick, and that's because, as Keenan mentioned before, it takes a lot of energy to raise those chicks. And so I've been doing a lot of reading about sibling aggression in black guillemot burrows, and because it is very kind of perplexing to us to see this kind of sibling aggression. And from what I've read, if these black guillemots are actually getting enough food, there shouldn't be too much sibling aggression in the burrow. However, what we've seen in the past few years with the guillemot cam seems to be that the way that the guillemots on Seal Island are being fed, sibling aggression does seem to be a fairly regular part of growing up in the nest. This year, we can be pretty certain that the sibling aggression was mainly due to the fact that there was very little food available. We see this in the tern nests, as Keenan said. Sibling aggression with tern chicks is very common, especially when food availability is low. You'll absolutely see the A chick, the older chick, attacking the B chick or the younger chick, and this is exactly what we're seeing in the guillemot burrow. But then again, it's last year we had very high productivity with our black guillemots, some of the highest it's been in the past 10 years, and so presumably there was plenty of food available, and yet we still had the bee chick die. So it's very difficult to say, and I think this kind of speaks to the value of the guillemot cam, is we're kind of learning more about how these chicks are growing and interacting on Seal Island. So yeah, again, we don't know much about it.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, I do want to add a couple things to that. Last year was a fantastic year for black guillemots in Seal Island. They did really well. Outside of that burrow, the burrow cam burrow, they did very well. We had quite a few nests that did fledge 2 chicks. Now, often you will see what we call some battle wounds on the younger chick, where they might have a little scar, or maybe the older chick might have beaten them up a little bit, but they still can survive if there's enough food. So we do see this with even good food, but more often when there's bad food. Now, we don't know too much about the guillemot diet, and because we don't monitor the guillemot diet, we're making an assumption that they don't have enough food because of what we're seeing with the terns. They're not getting enough food. We don't think the puffins are getting enough food. And on top of that, we have several guillemot chicks, or actually more than several, quite a few guillemot chicks throughout our productivity checks that were the younger chicks that unfortunately did not make it. They had a very light weight, which is an obvious indicator to us that they weren't getting enough food. So a combination of all these things, or maybe it's just aggressive behavior, and that is it's really just builds up when there's less food. So that's what we think is happening with these guillemots. Now, the important thing to remember is guillemots are laying 2 eggs because the benefits are huge. If they can fledge 2 chicks in a season, that is an incredible feat for those parents, and they're spreading more and more of their genes every year instead of just laying 1 egg and raising 1 chick. Now, this behavior is also a huge reason why black guillemot populations in the Gulf of Maine are doing pretty well. Puffins and guillemots were actually nearly extirpated, not completely, but guillemots did a little better during the 1800s and early 1900s, when people were killing these birds to eat them, or for their feathers, or to take their eggs. And neither guillemots or puffins did very well at all. But guillemots sprung back even faster after they were protected, because they laid 2 eggs and they could raise 2 chicks, and that led to a higher population growth. So it is a really important behavioral aspect of these black guillemots that they're doing this, and we think it is good for them, even though sometimes they can't raise the 2 chicks. And we often see with these seabirds what we call boom and bust years. Last year was certainly a boom year where we had terns that were raising 2 or 3 chicks successfully, and guillemots were doing the same, and cormorants, and even some gulls. They were very successful last year, and this has happened in previous years where we see high success, but then maybe the next year isn't as good. But they did benefit from the year before. So that's why these birds do it. They know that they can't always get a good year every single year. So I hope that kind of starts to answer your questions about the guillemots. Again, we don't know too much about them here specifically on Seal Island. We're trying to expand our knowledge about them, but most of our studies so far on the seabirds have been, especially on the puffins, hence Project Puffin, and a lot on the terns as well. So we're going to move on to some other questions. And the first question is regarding something that we're really excited about, which is our new burrow cam that we're putting in, that we're hoping is going to be out either later today or potentially tomorrow. It is all set up, and I did post a sneak peek picture that is pinned on, I believe I put it on the current burrow cam for the puffins. So if you haven't seen it yet, take a look at the chick. It's really cute. I forget how old it is. I think it's about 10 days old or something.
Yeah.
Almost 2 weeks old.
Mm-hmm.
We can confirm that for you. We do have notes on it. We do keep track of this burrow for our productivity checks. So we can tell you more about it, its exact hatch date, and when we first found the egg, and things like that. We'll post that onto the new chat board that will be with the new burrow cam. So the question about it is, how far are we from burrow 59? And maybe you can answer this question.
It's really in the kind of in the same area. It isn't exactly. It's not in the boulder berm, which you see on the boulder berm cam, where you can sometimes see burrow 59. It's actually behind the boulder berm cam, but it is fairly close by. It's still in that same area. And as you'll see, it's an interesting burrow. It's under a very large table rock, so there's lots of room down there for the puffin to move around, and it'll be an interesting one to watch.
Yeah, so it's about 20 feet behind the boulder berm camera, but it's on the exact opposite side where the camera doesn't spin. So unfortunately, you can't see it from the boulder berm camera, nor the loafing ledge camera. But as Isabel said, it's a much bigger burrow. It gets a lot of natural light, so it should get really clear, crisp images of these birds, and we're really excited about it.
Yeah.
And I think that the infrared, we've been having some trouble with infrared images to watch them at night, but I think that this newer camera that we just got should be really good, and it should be a fun time with these puffins, and I think that we'll at least have maybe 3 weeks, maybe probably a little bit more, maybe about 4 weeks with this puffin chick. So when we do post that, take pictures of feedings and everything like that. Let us know when they're getting feedings. We're interested in that, just like we did last year. Another question about burrow number 59, which is the current burrow cam that unfortunately doesn't have Phoebe or Finn back this year. Folks were wondering if Phoebe or Finn have been sighted this year, and unfortunately I don't think that they have. And another viewer was actually wondering if there was any updated theories about why they didn't come back. And we really don't know. And that's one of the great things that these puffin cams are teaching about, is we can find out which puffins are coming back to the burrow, what might happen if a new pair moves in. Perhaps Finn and Phoebe just found another burrow that was more attractive to them and they wanted to take that burrow. It seems unlikely. Maybe something happened to one of them and they had to find a new mate and they thus shifted burrows. It's really hard to say exactly what happened to them. We don't know. We're hoping that we're going to see them eventually, but there's a lot of puffins here. If there's about 500 pairs of puffins on this island, there could be around 1,000 puffins that move in around the island daily, plus others that maybe be prospecting for future years. So there's a lot of puffins that we have to look through, and to see it through a spotting scope, it really has to land in that right spot where you can read the leg bands. So it's a lot harder. It's really hard to pick through all those puffins and get lots of bands. So I think that this one, let's see, there's lots of questions about climate change and what we can do about the how much food supply there is. Now, I think the next question that we should answer, maybe some of you do know the answer to this question, but I think it's an important one to answer, is do the birds lay eggs all year or only during certain times of the year? And I think this gives us a really cool opportunity to talk about the migration of these birds and why they come here to nest. So maybe Isabel can start talking about some of the birds here and maybe a part of their life history of laying eggs and why they lay them this time of year.
Okay, so many of the birds, so to answer your question, it depends on the species. Terns occasionally most of the birds that we see nesting here will start to lay their eggs in the late spring, and some of them do occasionally lay again. Terns are one species that if their nest fails, they will lay again. But the point I think we want to get at here is when they're laying their eggs and the timing of them laying their eggs and having their chicks hatch is really important, because it's all synced up with the hatching and the availability of the food in the Gulf of Maine. And so basically a lot of these terns have evolved, or a lot of these seabirds have evolved to have their chicks hatching just as the fish that they feed their chicks with, that are just the right size, these larval fish, are going to be in the area and at the right depth for them to be able to catch to feed their chicks. And one of the things that we've been seeing, or that we suspect to see with changing climates, with warming sea temperatures in the future, is that actually those fish are changing their hatching dates. They're actually hatching a little bit earlier, and they're also changing their ranges are shifting as well. And so of course the problem with that is some of these seabirds, it's difficult to say whether or not they're going to be able to shift their own breeding behaviors and the timing of their breeding to coincide with those the changes in the fish breeding and hatching and the availability of those larval fish. And there's some evidence to suggest that puffins have been able to shift their breeding a little bit earlier to coincide with those larval fish. But some of the tern species, in particular Arctic terns, there's evidence to suggest that they perhaps are not shifting, and so you end up with sort of a mismatch with the availability of the larval fish and the timing of the hatching of the chicks, which is definitely a problem going to the future. Climate change, it's hard to predict all of what the effects are going to be on these seabirds, and one of the things we've definitely been able to see with our studies here are changes in the sizes of the fish that we see, changes in the species. As I mentioned, the warmer weather or warmer sea temperature adapted species of fish are becoming more common, and so these are all changes that we're kind of seeing. Yeah.
Now I want to go back just a little bit, just to talk more about what Isabel was saying earlier. Now these birds just come here during about a 3 or 4 month period to raise their young, and the amazing thing is that these birds are flying hundreds of miles, if not thousands of miles, during the winter. Now what's really important to note is that these birds only lay their eggs once a season, first of all. Now the terns are really remarkable creatures. They fly, some of our terns go all the way down to Argentina for the winter. Those are the common terns that winter along the coast of South America, perhaps some of them in the Caribbean as well. But a lot of them go down to Argentina, Brazil. We know this because we have some partners that that are down in Argentina and Brazil that are actually banding some of these terns, and we actually get them with the Brazilian or Argentinian bands when they come north again. The Arctic terns fly incredibly far. We have Arctic terns that have nested here for about, some of them almost 30 years. Now those terns that are doing that, some of them, they fly all the way down to Antarctica and then all the way back. And some of those terns have flown to the moon and back again, and then halfway back to the moon again in their lifetime, which is just unbelievable to think about that. Now, the important thing about this in terms with food supply and the availability for their chicks is that if they do that, and things are shifting to be earlier and earlier, the productivity of the Gulf of Maine, the winter is warming, and that changes the timing of the fish availability, the plankton blooms, all sorts of things like this are changing, and they're shifting to be earlier because of climate change. Now, just like Isabel was saying, but if those birds don't know that because they're migrating north from Antarctica, then they might not be able to get that timing synced with their chicks. So this is something that we're really keeping an eye on, and we want to know how these birds are adapting to this. The puffins are similar. They're wintering in very pelagic waters, hundreds of miles off the coast of New York and New Jersey. We discussed this last time in our last live chat, how Project Puffin unraveled the mystery of where our puffins are going during the winter. And just kind of sticking with this climate change trend here, another person was wondering if there's positive benefits from climate change. I think that there, it's hard to say, but I think that most of them are negative, unfortunately. But we could be seeing some positive changes. We don't know exactly what's going to happen in the Gulf of Maine, and we don't know how these seabirds are going to adapt to changes that we're seeing, such as a changing prey source or changing temperatures. But we do know that maybe some new fish species could come in that could be really beneficial to these seabirds, and we just don't know about that yet. My guess is that it's not a great sign what we're seeing so far, but it's too early to tell if there's any benefits or any, but we'll see. Let's see. Which one do you want to do next? We have lots of questions, which is great.
Yeah,
this is awesome. Thank you. I think we just want to clarify this one question first. That is it true that there was a time where guillemots were hunted for sport? They weren't necessarily hunted for sport per se. It was more of people were interested in getting their feathers for hats, especially in England. They were especially interested in getting the eggs, and they were especially interested in eating the birds for meat. So they weren't necessarily killing them for sport. They did serve some type of purpose, but it was still detrimental to their populations. And this person was wondering if there was a time where the guillemot population was threatened, and the answer is certainly yes. Everything from gulls to puffins to terns. In the Gulf of Maine, there was a time where all of those species were threatened, but this was before, in the late 1800s and 1900s, before people really started keeping an eye on these populations, and before the Migratory Bird Treaty Act went into place. So they were never... they had some time to recover before we could label them as threatened or endangered. Here's another question right here regarding the guillemots. And Isabel, will there be a banding program on Seal Island for the guillemots?
So the answer to that is there actually already is one. So when we monitor around 50 burrows for productivity each year, and at the end of the season, when those chicks reach a certain age and certain size, usually right before they fledge, we will band all the chicks that have survived up to that point. We also occasionally will band adults as well, but for the most part, it's just the productivity chicks, and so we do see those birds come back. We have seen resighted birds that have nested here in the past, and guillemots are birds that return often return each year to the same burrow, so we see those birds in subsequent years often.
And one of the things about that makes the guillemots tricky is that it's really difficult to read their bands in the field, and part of this is because the guillemots aren't always. You don't see guillemots too often on the loafing ledge camera, and that's kind of typical for all around where the puffins nest. And this is for a couple of reasons. The puffins they take the best locations over the guillemots. They can typically kick a guillemot out of a burrow if they want it. Number one, so there's not as guillemots around. There's not a lot of guillemots around where we're putting an effort to recite puffins and other birds like terns. The second problem is that if you look at the puffins, they often walk around straight upright like a person. Guillemots kind of waddle around and they kind of sit back on their knees a little bit. So it's very difficult to read the bands compared to a puffin that's sitting up straight. So we do band them, but reciting them and seeing their bands again is quite difficult. So that's what's happening with guillemots. We are banding them, and actually last year I saw the first guillemot that was ever banded on Seal Island, which was kind of exciting. So this is a good question, because we're talking about guillemots again. What is your perspective on censoring graphic nature cams? Is there a point where you would want to shut off one of the bird cams from public viewing? You want to tackle that one?
Yeah, so this is kind of a tough question, and it gets into a lot of kind of morally weighted questions as well. And of course, I mean, just to begin, we don't censor these cams. We're not trying to censor these cams. Of course, there are exceptions. For example, when we had the tern chick fall into the nest and subsequently was killed by the guillemot parent. Unfortunately, all of that happened right on camera, and you know, we saw that happening and decided that the best option was to go out there and remove the chick, and so we did turn off the cam to remove the chick from the burrow, so it wouldn't be, you know, suffering any further injury, and you know, I apologize to anyone who saw that as censorship, but I mean, of course, if we had not have done that, it would have been in there for a very long time, and I don't think anybody really wanted to see that. So
yeah. The adult guillemot wouldn't have removed that tern chick,
no,
even though it had died in the burrow.
Exactly.
So it would have been sitting there. So we thought the best thing was to remove it. It was probably a better situation for that young guillemot chick in there, so it wasn't sitting on a dead tern chick. So we decided to remove it and shut off the cam. And our intentions are never to keep anything away from you guys. You always have the option of shutting off the camera if you don't want to watch it. And we do see some sad things that happen on these cams. But the important thing is that you guys are seeing what's happening out here and seeing why we should protect fish supplies and these birds. And I think that really leads nicely into another one of our questions, which was regarding, is there anything that we can do to support this food supply for all the birds here? And there certainly is. I think that it's important to note that there's a lot of there's currently no protection of sand lance. There's no regulations really on sand lance whatsoever in the Gulf of Maine and in Massachusetts, which is a big problem. There isn't currently a strong fishery for sand lance at all, but if there was a fishery to develop, then that could be a bad thing. So if there was ever a petition to stop a fishery from being developed on sand lance or something else, then it would be great if you could support something like that, because that's really something that we want to protect for the future generations of these birds. They really need food like that. It's also, there's so many. The fisheries is a very difficult thing because it's the livelihood of a lot of families throughout the United States and in other countries, and we want to make sure that those fishermen are getting enough money and they can support their families and things like that. But we also want to protect our wildlife, and we want to make sure people are getting enough food. So it's a very complicated situation. But when you go to the store and you buy fish maybe to eat for dinner, or it's best to buy the most sustainably harvested fish that you possibly can buy. It's sometimes more expensive, but when you eat it, you can be happy and you can think, okay, well, I did a good thing because maybe I'm helping out some bird populations somewhere. And it's not just in the Gulf of Maine; it's all throughout the world where seabirds really rely on fish populations. So I think that's a huge thing that you can do, and help people become aware of this, because fisheries and the birds here all blend together, and we need to really work together to figure something out where we can support fishermen and support the birds, and save all these populations and really help people too. Now let's see. Someone asked, is this the only island off the United States eastern coast where puffins nest?
No, that's not the case. In U.S. waters, there are two other islands where puffins nest. One of them is Eastern Egg Rock, which is south of Seal Island. Eastern Egg Rock was actually the first, the island that kind of started Project Puffin. It's where the first reintroductions of puffin chicks occurred back in the 80s. No, sorry, back in the 60s. 70s. And so that's where Project Puffin started. There's still a booming puffin colony there, and the other island where puffins currently are found is Matinicus Rock, which is just north of Seal Island, and they also have a very large puffin colony there, even a little bit bigger than the Seal Island colony. And so those are the three islands where puffins nest in U.S. waters. There are also some farther north as well, including Machias Seal Island is one of them.
There's a few more in the Gulf of Maine as well. They're north of here, including Petit-Manan Island, that has a very large population of puffins and razorbills as well. There's several islands, but still, the Gulf of Maine population, it still isn't as big as it once was, and we want to keep growing it, getting it bigger, start including new islands. That's our goal, is to really spread these populations and grow them, and that's what we're trying to do, working with Fish and Wildlife Service and working with the folks on Machias Seal Island. We're trying to grow that population of puffins to make it really strong and healthy. I think this is a good question to go to next, which is some people are going to Booth Bay, Maine next weekend to take a puffin tour, and they're asking if they'll see lots of birds next week. I think that you probably will. If you're going out of Booth Bay, you might be going to Eastern Egg Rock. It's a much smaller island than Seal. It's only 7 acres compared to almost 70 acres here on Seal Island, so it's quite small. But they do have about 150 pairs of puffins that are nesting on that island. So you should see puffins both on the water and on sea, on the water when you're on the boat, and also on land on the rocks of the island. So you'll see them both there, and I think that you have a really great time. Now, also talking about puffin populations, someone else asked, are these puffins the same ones that hang out in Iceland?
So no, they're not actually. This is a unique population that we have here. It's actually kind of interesting that you should mention Iceland, and I think there will be a blog post about this coming out fairly soon. But up until recently, we thought that our Arctic tern population was also just basically the population that exists here in the Gulf of Maine. However, we just recently had a resighting of a bird, a young bird, a second summer bird that was banded in Iceland last year. So that's actually the first time an Arctic tern has been resighted that was banded in Iceland, and that shows kind of some interesting population in the United States. So interesting population dynamics going on there.
And just to clarify Isabel's answer, the Gulf of Maine population of puffins is completely cut off from the Icelandic puffins. However, it is the same species.
Mm.
They're still Atlantic puffins in Iceland and over in Scotland and all over the place in the North Atlantic. So they're the same species, but the puffins on Seal Island, they probably aren't coming in contact ever with populations of puffins in Iceland, and certainly not nesting with them. Let's see. Some folks were asking about C3, which was an exciting puffin that we had that was originally hatched on Egg Rock, who was the offspring of one of the Adopt-a-Puffins from our Adopt-a-Puffin program. And they were wondering if C3 had a burrow of his own yet that we know about. And unfortunately, we haven't seen C3 again. Now, C3 I believe it was a 3-year-old puffin. Yes, it's its 3rd summer. And it's not unusual for 3rd-year puffins to really roam around, check out different islands. So I wouldn't be surprised if maybe C3 was seen on another puffin island like Petit Manan or Machia Seal. And there is a chance that maybe C3 went back to Eastern Egg Rock, but we have not seen C3 on Seal Island again, unfortunately. But we'd really love it if C3 went back to Eastern Egg Rock and he could join our community of Adopt-a-Puffins that we have on Eastern Egg Rock. It would be fantastic. But we don't know where C3 will end up. It's still a young puffin. It's unlikely that C3 will even breed next year. It's a potential, but maybe it'll really pin down its burrow next year, and then the following summer it'll probably breed. Let's see. What will some of the fledgling chicks be facing once they leave the nest? What challenges will they face? This is a really interesting question because it really is. It's a challenge for these chicks their whole life, and I think that maybe we can talk about predation. We can talk about them finding food. We can talk about their migration. So, what do you want to add about that?
These tern chicks, they have a lot to deal with once they leave the nest. They are fairly vulnerable right now. When they first fledge, they're not very good flyers yet. They're very ungainly in the air, and they often crash land in the grass and end up in some interesting situations. And one of the things that we're seeing now, unfortunately, is the gulls that are on this island as well. They know that those fledgers are out there and that they're going to be an easy target, and so we have been seeing a lot of gull predation on those fledgling tern chicks that are just learning how to fly right now, and that's mostly great blackback gulls that are targeting those tern chicks. Peregrine falcons have also been known to frequent the island, and we've seen them several times, and they're a common predator of those. Of Arctic and common terns, and fledgers make great prey for them. As Keenan mentioned earlier, I mean, besides the predation, these fledgers they complete the longest migration of any bird, I believe.
The Arctic terns.
The Arctic terns complete the longest migration of any bird, and so that's quite a feat in itself. And they really, they rely on the resources that are available to them to really be able to complete that migration. So they do have a lot to deal with, these fledgers, and we hope for the best for them, but there's definitely plenty of challenges that they face.
All right, so another question we have is a good one. That is, thank you for letting us be a part of your research. Has the research you've collected from the Explore cams taught you anything you wouldn't have known before? And I think that's a terrific camera question, because we're learning so much from these cameras, and a lot of it might not be things that maybe seem like a big deal, but I think that they are, and a lot of these things have to do with the behavior of what's happening underneath the rocks and in the burrows, because we don't see that world as researchers. We only really see puffins above ground, and when we're inside of the rocks, maybe banding chicks or weighing chicks. So we never really get to see them naturally behave. So one of the things that I'm just excited about is it's a bummer that those adults, Phoebe and Finn, didn't come back to burrow 59 this year. But we're starting to learn about what happens when maybe a new puffin pair moves into town and takes over a burrow. We don't know much about this, and so it's exciting for us to see these interactions between a new pair. Maybe it's fascinating to me that the new pair of puffins haven't laid an egg yet, but they're really using the burrow a lot. They're taking a lot of time. They're fixing up the burrow, and they're probably getting ready for next year. So it's a really cool thing to watch that we don't get to see that often. We also have learned a lot about the feeding rate of puffins. You guys have been taking great notes about what the puffin chick was being fed in previous years, how often the puffin chick was being fed. This is all really great, useful data, so we can kind of understand how much fish a puffin needs to eat. In addition, when you guys maybe see a puffin on the loafing ledge and you take a picture, that can go into a reciting database, and we can see how often and when that puffin is being recited, and maybe how long that puffin is living. So there's a chance that if you're watching the loafing ledge, camera, and you take a picture of a band and you can read the whole band and we can identify that individual, maybe we haven't seen that bird in 20 years. We don't really know. So it's great data when you guys can get pictures of those puffins and we can put it into our database. So there's all sorts of things, and the great thing is we really don't know what these cameras are going to teach us in the future. So just us watching and learning from these puffins is a really big deal. So certainly the research that from the cams is a big deal. And we certainly appreciate you guys watching and keeping track of the birds. So the next question is, what is the purpose of the puffin statue on the rocks?
All right, so the puffin statue, the puffin decoys, as we call them, those are there to actually attract puffins to those sites. And puffin decoys were used when Project Puffin first began to attract puffins back to these breeding islands, and have been used in a number of settings to attract seabirds back to, or other colonial species back to breeding sites. Actually, decoys have been used all over the world now for that purpose, and are very effective. So yeah, when you see these days we have lots of puffins nesting here, and so just the presence of those puffins is functioning to attract more puffins. So the decoys aren't necessarily being used for that purpose anymore, but they are still a reminder of how Project Puffin began, and the effectiveness of that technique, and it's interesting to see the puffins interact with the decoys on camera.
Mm-hmm. We got another question about the diet of the birds, and the question was, is there a depletion of sand eels currently? And that's a really interesting question, because, and as I mentioned before, there's not a serious fishery in place for these sand lance. And what's interesting, so it's hard for us to track populations. However, there is a lot of current research that's going on. And there's some folks from NOAA down on Stellwagen Bank that are doing some great work monitoring sand lance, as they're a really important species for humpback whales, among other seabirds. And so there's a lot more interest going into these sand lance because we know that they're huge for all the seabirds and all the life in the Gulf of Maine. Like I said, we're still learning a lot, so we don't know exactly what's happening with them. But last year we had a huge year for sand lance, and this was everywhere in the Gulf of Maine, from Cape Cod all the way up to Machias Sail Island at the mouth of the Bay of Fundy. So it's really interesting that this year we're seeing almost none. But before last year, we didn't have huge, big sand lance years in terms of the amount that we saw in the diet of the puffins and of the terns. We had never seen as much as we had seen last year. So it's really hard to say what's going on with that. But perhaps in the future we'll have some more questions about that as we analyze some of our data, and we'll certainly share that with you guys when we find out more about that. So unfortunately I can't give you a true answer about sand lance populations, but I can tell you that there's a lot of folks that are working towards answering that question. So another question is, what other nesting birds are on the island? So maybe you can tell them more about our other nesting species.
Okay, so I believe this is asking what other nesting birds there are besides the puffins, perhaps. So the ones that there are a number of birds that nest on this island, seabirds and other species as well. The birds that we monitor are mostly the seabirds, so the Atlantic puffins, the black guillemots, the common and Arctic terns, and the razorbills. However, we also have Leach's storm petrels that nest on the island. We also have savanna and song sparrows that nest here. Double-crested and great cormorants nest here. Great blackback gulls and herring gulls nest here. The occasional laughing gull, and an assortment of other species. Spotted sandpipers, one. Occasionally common yellowthroat, which is a type of warbler. And let's see, am I forgetting any?
We have a lot of savanna sparrows and song
I
sparrows
think
as well.
You got those. Yep.
Yeah, I didn't hear you say that one.
They're
yeah,
so
there's
there
a
are a
lot.
lot. It's a very productive island in terms of bird species.
Yep. Let's see. Can you just clarify what colonial species means, Isabel?
So I think I was referring to specifically colonial seabirds. Puffin is an example of a colonial seabird because many puffins will nest on the same island. Terns are another example. Razorbills as well. Basically, all of the seabird species that we have here nest colonially.
Yeah, and that means that they really depend on each other for protection from predators. That's why they're all nesting together. All these terns are together because if there was just one lone tern nesting on the island, then there's a high chance that that bird would be predated. When you start adding more and more and more terns, they all kind of work together to deter predators, and we often see a whole mass of terns, hundreds, if not the whole colony, chasing something like a peregrine falcon or a blackback gull, and they're pretty successful at deterring these predators. Whereas if there wasn't as many, they might get hit really hard by the predators and not be very successful. So, let's see. Okay, so I think this is kind of a confusing question, but I think that the viewer is asking, how do the birds hold all these fish like sand lance, or herring or hake? How do they hold them onto the bill? And I think that's specifically talking about puffins and razorbills that can carry more than one fish in at a time. Terns, they very rarely will bring in more than one fish. It's unusual. Last year we saw it a lot with the sand lance. It was possible for a tern to grab more than one fish, but we think that was just kind of a coincidence that maybe a tern was diving in to get a fish, and it got two, so it was a really happy and lucky tern. But I don't think that a tern, if it tried, could grab two fish at the same time. It would be, or could get two fish separately, meaning they caught one and then go catch another one. They can't really do that, and that's just because of the morphology of their bill. Whereas puffins, if you ever look at a close-up of a puffin mouth, you can see these little kind of backwards indentations that hold the fish into the bill. So the puffins can pull a fish back. They usually go for some reason they always have the bigger fish in the back, which makes a lot of sense. So maybe they go for those bigger fish first. They can pull it back to the very back part of their mouths and hold it back there, and then they can continue to keep catching fish, often the smaller fish, until the whole bill is filled up. It gets held in there by those little grooves in the bill. So that's why puffins can come back with a whole bunch of fish at the same time. Terns can't. Let's see here. We only got a few more minutes, so if there's any last questions that people have, please get them in quickly. Perhaps this could be a good question. What can we do as a society to change or help with climate change to help these birds succeed in the environment? It's a really good question. Climate change is a big deal to these seabirds and also so many other birds that you might have in your backyard. And one of the kind of interesting things is that about climate change is that maybe some birds might be more affected by climate change than others. Maybe they're at the southern end of their range, like these puffins and Arctic terns, or maybe there's something happening with their food resources being depleted because of climate change. But the important thing that we can do, it might be really hard to stop climate change, even though everyone can do their part by maybe reducing their fossil fuel use or buying locally grown food, and so many other things that we'll talk about. But specifically for birds is we can reduce other stressors like disturbance or habitat loss. If we can reduce these things, then the effects of climate change may be less subtle on those species. So maybe leaving habitat for birds in your backyard, or maybe if you see a flock of roosting shorebirds on the beach, leaving them alone, then reducing stressors from people is really important, and I think everybody can work on doing that together. We got one more question here. Do both parents feed the chicks with all species? Maybe you can tackle that one.
Okay. Yeah. So I think what's being asked here is do both
parents feed the chicks in the nest for all the different species that we're working
nest
with?
Here. Okay.
Yep.
Got it. So so many of them do. Puffins, both parents do. Guillemots, yes. Terns as well. Although I've read that the female does most of the brooding when the chicks are fairly young, so the male does more of the provisioning during the earlier stages. But as the chicks get larger, they require both parents to bring fish in to feed it. Let's see what else. Yeah, razorbills, same thing. So with these seabirds, for the most part, because they're raising only one or two chicks, they're putting so much energy into those chicks, and it requires both parents to be hunting and bringing in fish in order to raise those chicks. Most of our species, that is the case.
Yeah, and the only exceptions that I can think of with that one is the roseate tern, which doesn't nest on Seal Island, but it does nest on some of the other Project Puffin Islands. It's in the northwest population, the northwest Atlantic population of roseate terns, which is endangered. And the razorbills, actually, that'll be fed by both the male and the female until it's about 2 weeks old, or nearly 3 weeks old. And around that time period, the chick actually will leave the nest. So razorbills actually spend less time in the nest as a chick than do puffins. Now, when that chick leaves the nest, it goes off with its dad, and the dad actually feeds it at sea. So that's kind of a cool fun fact about razorbills, and we might start seeing less razorbills on the loafing ledge camera because this is happening. The razorbills are leaving the island to raise their chicks. The last question is, how long will you stay on the island this year?
We'll be on the island until the first week of August. I believe our end date is August 8th this year.
Yep.
And of course we started the season at the very beginning of May. So we've been out here for about 3 months, or we will be out here for about 3 months. It's been a good season so far.
All right, well, I think we just ran out of time. If you guys have more questions, perhaps you can save them for a future live chat. You can also ask them on the comment board. We've been pretty busy lately, but I think we're going to start having some more free time to spend some more time answering some of your questions, so you can post them there. And look out for some blog posts by us. We have some ideas for some future blog posts. I think the last thing that we want to say is keep an eye on those cams. It's an exciting time of year. We have a lot of young puffins coming back to the island to start prospecting in the future. These kind of the last months of the breeding season, often July and the beginning of August, is when we have young puffins, maybe 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds that come back and start thinking about looking for burrows and looking for mates. So this is your best opportunity to see old puffin chicks that were raised in the burrow cam, maybe on the loafing ledge if we're really lucky. And this is the best time for us to see puffin chicks like Hope. So we'll let you know if we see anybody, and please share your photos, share your observations of the cameras. We're not always watching these, we're often in the field doing stuff, so anything you can tell us is really valuable. So thank you guys for bringing all these questions to us. It was really great that we had all these questions today, and please think of some questions for future live chats. Yeah, and thanks a lot, and we'll talk to you guys again soon.